Ken Reischmann here for North Avenue Nation with Dr. Tricia Mulligan of the Political Science Department here at Iona College. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And we're going to get right into it because you've done a good amount of educating over the last decade, but could you do just a little more and try and educate everybody on what exactly is ISIS?
Sure. So ISIS is a group that has emerged in Iraq and in Syria, and their common denominators, they're Islamic, and they would like to wage war to create a state that is independent of the current governments in place. What's been really, I think, interesting and terrifying to some people about this group is how much support they've been drawing worldwide. People recruiting from the United States, from Australia, as well as from other Muslim countries. But I think the real issue for them is to dislodge the governments in Iraq and Syria and create a greater state.
And we hear a lot from politicians high up in our nation who mention ISIL. Is there a difference between ISIL and ISIS?
I think the only difference is in the language. They're the same group. One refers to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria versus the Levant, which is where the L comes in. But they're the same group.
And of course, in the early 2000s, we were very nervous as a country about the terrorist group Al Qaeda. Is there what is the fundamental difference between the fear of Al Qaeda and the fear of ISIS?
I think one of the things that distinguishes ISIL or ISIS from other terrorist groups like Al Qaeda and others is that, first of all, they're sectarian. They're emphasizing a brand of Islam, which is Sunni versus Shiite. And that's something that previous groups, such as Al Qaeda, have not done. They have a very particular vision. And I think this is one of the things that will help the United States and its allies and try to combat them, because there are countries like Iraq, for example, which have sizable Shiite populations that don't wish to be re-subsumed under a Sunni leadership. And so you do have cooperation there. I think, they are interested in having a particular region under their control. There have been murmurings, of course, and news releases about reports of alleged violence to be committed against Western powers, but to date that hasn't happened, and hopefully that won't happen. But for now, they seem to be sort of limited to their struggle to secure territory in that part of the world.
Again, Ken Reischmann here for North Avenue Nation, talking ISIS with Dr. Tricia Mulligan. And Dr. Mulligan, is there a lot of politics of fear in this, or is this a legitimate threat that we should be worried about?
I think the answer is both. I think that when you have a group that begins to take territory from the Syrian government, that becomes a threat to Turkey, one of our closest allies, NATO, et cetera, that there is concern about where they might stop. I think the fact that Westerners have been executed is a particular concern, and terrorists of any stripe are always dangerous. In terms of fear, I think that people are concerned that a 9/11 will happen again, that will this be the next sponsor of that sort of event. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that there is a healthy concern about how American response will further, develop a threat. Right now, the airstrikes are a concerted effort with Middle Eastern countries' support, Turkey, of course, being the latest addition to that. If there gets to be the point where there's additional troops on the ground, for example, to be required, I think that would be a greater concern, security concern for the U.S. and its partners at this point.
And as somebody who's been around foreign politics and foreign policy of the United States for so long, what do you think is the best option for us as a nation to combat this terrorist group?
I think one of the things that the U.S. has to be very careful about is maintaining a multilateral coalition. I think there's already enough sentiment in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, that the U.S. has been an imperial presence and interfering in politics in that region. I think this situation is somewhat different because it's aiding people who are asking for assistance, but it can't just be a U.S. effort. And so I think involving NATO, involving other partners in the Middle East are a really important part of the policy that the U.S. needs to pursue. I think strategically striking areas where ISIS is gaining economically, the oil fields, for example, where they're profiting on the black market, that seems to be of strategic importance. I think the U.S. has to be very careful about avoiding civilian areas. That's been a problem for drone attacks, et cetera, where civilians are mistakenly targeted, but it creates anger and resentment nonetheless. So I think that's something that has to be considered. I don't know that ground troops right now are a very good idea, or if they would have the designed impact that people think that they might have. In an area where you have so many recruits kind of coming from different directions, I'm not even really sure how you'd mount a military strategy at this point.
Mm-hmm. And just to go back a few weeks, you heard the President of the United States speak a little bit on ISIS about a week ago, I believe. And what did you hear from the President that was different from this speech than every other foreign policy speech that he's given, if there was anything?
I think he sounded much more like his predecessor than he has previously, with the emphasis on military force. I think one of the things that was interesting that he indicated, and that the President of Iran actually articulated in his General Assembly remarks a few weeks ago, is that this is an ideological extremist group, right? That there's a very, I think, important concern with not labeling all Muslims, of course, as shouldn't be the case. But the fact that the President of Iran is also identifying this as a threat, I think, gives some additional credibility to what President Obama identified as a problem. But I think his tone is much more aggressive than it has been previously.
All right. Well, that's Dr. Tricia Mulligan, Chair of the Political Science Department at Iona College. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Kenny.
For North Avenue Nation, I'm Kenny Reischmann.